Well, hello there, and welcome back to HS211, History of the Restoration Movement. In this second lecture, we will be setting the stage for how the institutions of democratic thinking and American Christianity came to be viewed and sometimes even fused together, for better or for worse. So to begin with, we will review the history of the American Revolution and pay particular attention to how political dissent in the 13 colonies contained all the necessary religious overtones to make the revolution a holy calling. Afterward, we will look at the religious and philosophical ideas that went into the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and note how they are not necessarily connected with what would be called traditional Christianity. And we will end this lecture with the introduction of a hermeneutical question, or an interpretive question, that would drive the American politics and biblical interpretation for the next 200 years. And that question is just simply, do we read with a loose or a strict constructualism? Well, let me start off this lecture by making a simple observation about the American Revolution. The American Revolution was the most important event, bar none, for establishing the metanarrative of the American psyche. In terms of politics, values, morals, and even the very role of Christianity itself will radically change in the 13 colonies between the years 1770 and 1830. And going hand in hand with the establishment of this new country is also the advent of the largest revival in Christian history. Historians call this revival the Second Great Awakening. Now, one of those historians, a man by the name of Nathan Hatch, will even go so far as to say that the imprint that this whole time period leaves on America is indelible. It's ingrained. It's a part of the very fabric of who they are. And I strongly recommend his book, The Democratization of American Christianity, if this subject that we'll be talking about today appeals to you. Now, in this text, Hatch convincingly argues that the idea of American democracy and the institution of evangelical Christianity become fused together so that it was hard to keep the two ideas distinct anymore. Now keep that in mind, that this subject could be a topic that could cover an entire history class in and of itself, but we're only going to get one lecture. So what I'm going to attempt to do is to give you an overview of this complex process, how it came about, and we will try to focus on one particular outcome, and that outcome is the interpretive question of strict versus loose constructualism of authoritative documents. So, what caused the American Revolution? Well, let's start from the beginning here. How did it come about that the 13 British colonies on the east coast of North America came to challenge their parent country, which was unquestionably the most powerful nation in the world at the time? Well, the answer to that ultimately lies in the problems created in the aftermath of the 7-Year War, also known as the French and Indian War. It lasted from 1756 to 1763. Now, either way you want to describe it, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, either way, this war set up some circumstances that would explode into all-out revolution over the 15-year period after it ended. Now, the beginnings of this war between the French and the Indians and the British is not all that hard to understand. The French and the British have been, quite frankly, perennial powerhouses in Europe for centuries, and they had fought many wars in Europe up until this point. The French, at this time, controlled the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, and they also controlled the very lucrative fur trade that went with it. The British controlled the eastern coastline. And so the area where the Appalachian Mountains meet these major river valleys will become highly contested areas. And the British and the French will battle for control of these areas in western Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and even in upstate New York. If I could probably simplify this a little bit more, let's just put it this way. The two major world powers at this time were trying to control the most area in North America, and there simply wasn't enough space for both of them. Now, the French did arguably control more land because the large rivers, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Ohio, gave them much more access to land. But the British had a more concentrated population. And so by the time this war breaks out, the British will outnumber the French about 5-1, leading the French to look for native allies. So the early years of this war were very costly for the British. For example, General Edward Braddock, supposedly one of the best British generals available, will be soundly defeated at the Battle of Fort Duquesne in 1755. The year before that, a young officer by the name of George Washington will be defeated as well. And so just keep in mind that early on, the French are really coming close to winning this war. However, a British Prime Minister by the name of William Pitt will pursue an agenda of total war against the French and will authorize a spending of about 137 million British pounds sterling. That's their currency. And all of that money will be channeled into the war effort during the 7 Years' War. Now, keep that large number in mind, because this money didn't just appear magically out of a hat. Somebody was going to have to pay that bill when the war was over and that bill became due. And by 1760, the British and American colonists had regained the momentum in the war, and they turned it into a rout of the French and their Native American allies. And this was largely due to just the superior amount of money, men, and supplies that were flowing in from Britain. And the result of all this is that the French will cede or hand over their colonies east of the Mississippi River to British control. Now, that large frontier that we discussed about in our last lecture is now firmly in British hands, and the more adventurous people living in the 13 colonies will be very eager to settle it. But the problem is, those people on the East Coast in those 13 colonies will inherit a staggering war debt. And so, for the next 12 years, problems between the colonies and their parent government, the British government back in England, will continue to mount. The first of these problems began almost immediately with what's known as the Proclamation of 1763, and this proclamation strongly discouraged new settlers from traveling into the new frontier territories, such as western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. And this may explain why the settlers after the Revolution were so resolute on let's get out to the frontier, because for the 2 decades leading up to the American Revolution, they'd never been given official permission to go. But as we had said previously, the biggest problem is the war debt. And the British Parliament, which is their governing body, began to an ever-increasing regiment of taxation on the colonies to help them pay for their share. Now, these taxes included things like the Stamp Act of 1765, the Tea Tax of 1773, and the related Boston Tea Party that went with it. Now, many that are within the colonies will demand that Parliament will have no right to tax them unless they also give representation, i.e., there must be an elected representative from the colonies sitting on Parliament. And this made sense after all. If Parliament had the power to tax them, the colony said we should at least have 1 or 2 voices in that elected body speaking up for our interests. Well, this situation will quickly escalate into violence, especially in the city of Boston. For example, in 1770, the Boston Massacre will occur. A snowball fight will turn into bullets flying, and before you know it, 5 are dead and 6 more are injured. By 1773, the Boston Tea Party will become a nationally recognized symbol of American resistance. So, most of that is probably history that you're already somewhat familiar with. And to be honest, most Americans tend to look at that history with a fair degree of kind of rose-tinted glasses. That this was kind of our glory days moment, if it were. Well, it's at this point that I get to stir the pot just a little bit by asking this question. What does the Bible say about all this? What does the Bible say about revolution? And I guess more to the point, what does God think when countries start revolutions? Well, surprisingly, In spite of how much support there was for the American Revolution from people that were religious, people that were ministers, people that were seminary-trained professors, that even though there's a lot of support from religious people, it's actually extremely hard to justify a tax revolt if all you're doing is relying on the Bible. After all, when Jesus was asked about the problem of paying taxes to Caesar, he clearly taught that a subjected people should pay their taxes. And considering that the Roman government at the time was a dictatorship, and they were not about to give representation to the Jews in Judea, this sort of rules out the possibility of adding exceptions to Jesus' teaching. Simply put, if there was ever a time for Jesus to say, it's all right to stand up against an oppressive government that taxes its people, it would have been here in Matthew 22. But since Jesus did not, the religious colonies, or the religious people in the colonies, would be forced to rely on philosophical ideas, and sometimes passages from the Old Testament to justify their revolution. They could look to things like the book of Judges and see, oh, when the people of Israel are oppressed, God raises up someone to deliver them. But it's a very far stretch to say what applied to Israel applied to the American colonies. And so while we're at it, let's add just a little bit more fuel to this fire now. We have Paul's teachings in Romans 13, verses 1 through 4, where Christians are told to be submissive to their governments. And once again, keep in mind, Paul is writing this to a people in Rome in a day when the government is not made up of Care Bears and My Little Ponies that basically are full of glitter and rainbows. When he wrote this, he's writing this about the Roman government. And this is arguably one of the most evil governments the world has ever seen. And yet Paul tells Christians to submit to this government. And he says submit to them because nobody has put them in charge except God himself. And for Paul, there's really only one legitimate form of rebellion, and that is you may rebel against a government that tells you not to preach the gospel. Other than that, he encourages you to submit to the government, whatever their laws may be. And so this raises a very interesting question. Was the American Revolution morally wrong? Well, my simple answer to this is, I believe it was. I am certain that there will be many of you in this class who will disagree with this assessment, but I do bring this up for a good reason. Many Christians, and particularly some important people within the Restoration movement that we will study, will start to rethink this issue of war and armed conflict as they read their Bibles and realize that the rhetoric of this country does not necessarily line up with the rhetoric from the Bible. Since Christian unity was a major goal of the Restoration movement, they realize very fast that nothing breaks unity faster than pointing a weapon at someone for political or secular reasons. For them, this was even worse than Paul's analogy in 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul says, an eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you as part of this body. In this case, where you actually have Christians fighting and going to war against one another, what you have is a case of amputation for non-religious reasons. And so, as we go through this semester, we will see this problem of armed conflict come up every time there's fighting between Christians. Can Christian unity survive when Christian people are at war with one another? This will be one of the major questions we'll be asking throughout this class. So, right or wrong, a revolution did break out. And from the years of 1775 to 1783, the 13 colonies were at war with their parent country, England. I wish that I could say that Washington's Continental Army won every battle easily, but the reality of the matter is it took quite a lot of help from the French, and it took quite a lot of dogged determination from the rebels themselves in order to win this war. Now, it's true, the Patriots will win quite a few big-name battles. They'll win Saratoga. They'll win at Yorktown. They'll win at Ticonderoga. But these are kind of the exceptions. Washington was much better at keeping his army from getting captured. And the reason for England's acknowledgement of the independence of the colonies has more to do with debt assessment, rather than running out of men or money to continue the fighting. Simply put, the British were becoming aware that the colonies were just simply more trouble than they were worth. And since for the British these colonies were just simply a business venture, they simply cut their losses when these colonies ceased to be profitable. So, if I could give an analogy, this is the basic plot of the first Rocky movie. The colonies never really had a chance of winning, but so long as they had the stamina to last longer than the British, they could still be declared victorious, so long as the other side gave up. And one of General Washington's assistants will assess the situation this way. This is a man named General Greene, and he puts it this way. He says, quote, "Don't you think we bear a beating very well? And at that, the more we are beat, the better we grow." Or to put this in layman's terms, we take a whipping very well, and our strength is that we always bounce back. Now, near the beginning of the American Revolution, a very important document will be produced by the First Continental Congress, and this is the Declaration of Independence. Now, this document is written by Thomas Jefferson, and it's ratified by this Congress on July 4th of 1776. And the Declaration stood as a testimony of the resolve of the colonies. They were purposed to end British rule over their colonies. And they declared themselves to be free from political control of King George III and from his parliament in the process. Which, needless to say, this created quite a controversial document. Now, for the purposes of our study, we must discuss two major religious issues. The first is that this document is a deistic document. It is not a Christian document. And the second issue we need to deal with is that the authority of this document is largely based on what can be called ad hominem arguments. So, let's talk about the religious convictions of this document. You see, many people are surprised when they read the Declaration of Independence that it speaks a lot about God, and yet there are relatively few explicitly Christian trappings about the document itself. Now, the reason for this is because the author of the document, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, had religious convictions that could only be described as heterodox or heretical, as opposed to the orthodox. You see, the religion of Jefferson and many of the other founding fathers who signed this declaration was known as deism. Now, this is a belief that the universe is created by a God who crafted the universe like a clock. He puts all the parts in place, he winds it up, and then he steps away and he allows it to run its course without any further interference from the divine realm. And the result is that the document can reference ideas about God, but it sees no reason to actually quote the Bible as a religious authority. Instead, the Declaration of Independence makes assertions about God and about His law based on a concept known as self-evidence. And this can be seen in the opening argument of the document where Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men are created equal, that they are empowered by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, as we talk about Christianity in America, this problem of self-evidence will come up again and again throughout this class. Many Christians will take many of life's truths about society, about theology, and even about God to be self-evident. And they will get rather upset with some people who go against this when they say, "I see this as self-evident," and people respond, "I don't see it that way." Here's an example. During the Civil War, many Christians in the South will use the self-evident arguments from nature and from some passages in the Bible to express why Caucasians are naturally superior to their African slaves. Well, the problem with self-evident arguments is that they depend on ad hominem debating, or what's better known as name-calling. You see, to express that an idea is apparent or self-evident also carries the undertone that if anyone disagrees with that assessment, they must either be somehow innately stupid, they must be insane, or they must just be blatantly evil to disagree with self-evidence. Well, needless to say, when it came to the Declaration of Independence, very few people in England thought that the colonists' self-evident claims were legitimate, and therefore Parliament and King George dutifully sent 5 armies to deal with the rebels. And the result of all this, and I cannot stress this enough for this class, is that Christians will rely heavily on arguments of self-evidence when they are debating here in America. And more than one theological debate over the next century and a half is going to crop up based on people making this kind of argument from self-evidence. Now, possibly the biggest problem the Declaration of Independence created for Americans is that it promised freedom to all. It basically makes the argument that tyranny and slavery are self-evidently bad, and this makes a lot of sense if you consider yourself a person on the receiving end of tyranny and slavery. But if you're a person who happens to be in a position of power or in control, i.e. you are the tyrant, you are the slaver, then such oppressive practices are sometimes viewed as necessary, even beneficial to society. And so, just to give one example out of probably hundreds I could have given you, we'll give a quote from a African apologist against slavery. His name was Frederick Douglass. And he had this to say about the Declaration of Independence and the holiday of July 4th, which commemorates it. He says this, quote, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals him more than all other days of the year. It reveals to him the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. You boast of your love for liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 million of your countrymen. You can bare your bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tax on tea, yet you wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of a black laborer in your country. You profess to believe that of one blood God has made all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has commanded all men everywhere to love one another, and yet you notoriously hate, and even glory in your hatred of all men whose skin are not colored like your own. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism a sham, your humanity a base pretense, and your Christianity a lie." And the result is that the Declaration of Independence, as a founding document, will set the bar so high that not everyone in this country is going to experience that same level of freedom. And this will be especially true when people such as the African slaves were viewed as property. And a document like the Declaration of Independence is specifically meant to safeguard a person's liberty and their liberty to obtain property. So look for this problem throughout the semester as well. When the ethics of Christianity and the ethics of the founding document, the Declaration of Independence, when they clash with the way society is working, we're going to see some pretty serious struggles, even warfare. And likewise, where we will also see many fights within Christianity between Christians, when some Christians take the side of the Bible, and when some Christians take the side of the Declaration, at least when they teach different things. Now, a last point I want to make about the Declaration of Independence is how it influenced other people within the Restoration movement to think and write in a particular format or style. And for the course of this study, the major point of contact between the Declaration of Independence will be with Thomas Campbell's 1809 manifesto known as the Declaration and Address. Now, Campbell did not attempt to copy Jefferson's words or his verbiage, and he really didn't try to copy his literary style either. But he did hope that his work would be accepted with a certain sense of profundity. And his title for the work is clearly meant to be an homage to Jefferson's Declaration. And, like Jefferson, who, when he wrote this document, shook the world politically, Campbell was hoping that this document would have a monumental impact for the kingdom of God. And in some ways, it did, as this document, which is known as the Declaration and Address, is regarded as one of the primary source documents for the early Restoration movement. And here in a few weeks, we will be studying this document in depth and covering basically every nook and cranny that we can find in this over 70-page document. So now, let's shift some gears and let's talk about the other major founding document of the nation, and that is the Constitution of the United States. For this study, it is important to note that the Constitution did not create a democracy as its form of government. That would be a form of government where every citizen gets a vote in every matter. Instead, the Constitution creates what's called a democratic republic. And this means that the citizens are allowed to vote for a representative. And these representatives are the ones who actually get the official say in government matters. Now, this state of affairs will prove to be both empowering and highly frustrating for a lot of American citizens. It will be empowering in that the common person will finally feel like they have real power and a real voice in the affairs of their government. And that power will come through their feeling that they get when they cast their vote. That their vote matters. That it is just as loud and just as weighty as the next human beings. However, it will be frustrating because anytime a representative did not adequately fulfill the spoken or unspoken desires of the people who voted for them, there's just going to be this rise of, this isn't what I asked for. And so the problem with the republic form of government is going to be if a representative does well, his constituency will be happy. If a representative does poorly, they will feel angry and betrayed. Now, another formidable aspect of the Constitution that I want to look at is the ingenious way it divides power between three branches of government. It created a system of checks and balances that were to ensure that no one branch of government became too powerful. Now, it should probably be said at this point that the idea of limiting governmental power is not a new idea, especially for people of British or English descent. As early as 1215, King John of England was forced to sign a document known as the Magna Carta in the town of Runnymede. And this document established England as what is known as a limited monarchy, as opposed to an absolute monarchy where the king has absolute power. By signing this document, John ceded certain privileges and powers to his nobles, and after about 500 years of these nobles having their power grow, shift, and develop, they will eventually become what we will know as the Parliament, a legislative body that produced many of the laws and policies for the entire country of England. And interestingly, the Magna Carta also gave some basic rights to all English citizens. And from that idea will come where we start to get ideas for a Bill of Rights. And many of the early colonies will adopt bills of rights for their state constitutions. And likewise, when the Constitution is ratified, a national Bill of Rights, this will be the first 10 amendments, will be added to that Constitution, and there will be a national Bill of Rights from which all American citizens receive protections and promises of what they can do. So, Let us put that idea of the Bill of Rights on hold here for a second. While I'd like to talk about it further, we simply just don't have the time for that here in this lecture, and we'll have to pick it up in another lecture. For this class, though, I want to focus on a particular problem, and that is the problem that the Constitution of the United States is a document. It's written on paper. It doesn't say anything until somebody reads it. And this document was drafted by numerous men that our country tends to call founding fathers, and it was ratified by the citizens of the first 13 colonies. But at the heart of this issue is that this document must be interpreted. And we have an entire branch of government, the judicial branch, that is made specifically to interpret this document. But we'll find very quickly, almost anyone will take a stab at interpreting this document in an authoritative way. Here would be just one example. The phrase separation of church and state never comes up in the First Amendment. It's simply not there. Now, the interpretive call to say that there should be a separation of church and state was made by Thomas Jefferson in 1801. And he specifically made that call when responding to a Baptist minister in a private letter. And the result of all this is that we're going to start seeing different interpretive frameworks come up for how do you interpret this document best. And for our study, the two most important of these frameworks are going to be known as loose constructualism and strict constructionalism. The early advocates of loose constructionalism were known as the Federalists, and they included such founding fathers as George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. So, loose constructionalism, simply put, did not see the silence of the Constitution as a prohibition. Just one quick example. The Constitution does not give the president the power to establish a cabinet of advisors. Yet George Washington, the first president, selected several prominent people to serve as his Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and so forth. And he did all of this without written permission from the Constitution. He simply did it because it was a shrewd and practical way to divide his responsibilities. Now, strict constructionalism, on the other hand, demands that an authoritative document like the Constitution must be followed to the letter. And those who liked this mindset were often known as the Jeffersonians, since in the early years of this political party, Thomas Jefferson was the most influential leader of this group. So, one of the best ways of demonstrating the tension between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians is to look at the issues surrounding the establishment of the First Bank of America in the year of 1791. You see, during the first term of Washington's presidency, the United States had a severe debt crisis. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, offered an attractive and a pragmatic solution to dealing with this. He knew that other nations had established national banks for the purposes of establishing a national line of credit and for producing coins and paper money for their currency. And Hamilton suggested that, if that's the way other nations work, the United States should form a similar institution. It's at this point that Jefferson and his associates are going to reject, and they're going to disagree with this idea vehemently. Their primary objection to everything that Hamilton wanted to do is that the Constitution does not allow for the creation of an organization like this. And for Jefferson, he demanded that an amendment to the Constitution was necessary to grant this kind of power. Now, in this instance, Jefferson and his company lost the argument, and the bank was established in 1791 without the passage of a constitutional amendment. And this example helps to set the stage for a question that will dominate our discussion throughout this class. Because, like the Constitution, the Bible is seen by many people as an authoritative document. At least I certainly see it this way. But what happens when the Bible is silent on an issue? Does silence equal permission, as a loose constructionalist would maintain, or does it equal a prohibition, as a strict constructualist would maintain. For better or for worse, many of the early advocates of the Restoration movement advocated for a strict constructual reading of the Bible. They were often frustrated by how many non-biblical ideas were dotting the theological landscape of Christianity, and their solution was to simply demand that if the Bible is silent, Christians should be silent and avoid making rules and doctrines based on that silence. And this would be the driving force for just about every first-generation advocate of the Restoration movement. Barton Stone, for example, will reject the Nicene and Apostles' Creeds because they are not found in the Bible. William Gyrie will reject infant baptism because the practice is not mentioned in the New Testament. Alexander Campbell will probably have the most strict constructualism of all the founders of the Restoration movement because he will advocate that only the New Testament should be used to create and support Christian doctrines and practices. Now, I'm sure you can probably already tell where this could be problematic. What about lights, pews, and things like flush toilets? Those aren't mentioned in the Bible. Does that mean we cannot have them inside a church building? What about hymnals or books of Christian fiction? Can Christians use them or read them since they are not mentioned in the Bible? We will call this the problem of silence in this class, and we will see it raise up again and again and again. And one of the results of this problem of silence is that it will send people scrambling to find authorities. Who do I trust to help me interpret the scriptures and the silences? What makes a person a professional and capable to do this? How do I know if they're right? And for the longest time, when these questions came up, the church had a special class of people known as clergy, and they were the ones purported to have the answer. These people were often highly educated in the areas of Scripture. They often could read the original biblical languages. They had to pass several tests to make sure that their doctrine was orthodox. And they were often under the watchful eye of bishops or large denominational assemblies that would keep them from getting out of line. In short, church denominations maintained a monopoly on the authority to interpret scriptures. But on the frontier, these bishops and governing bodies are going to be very far away, often on the East Coast in places like Philadelphia or New York. And local ministers will often be packing a level of education that isn't quite up to par for the more, we'll call them well-educated gentry on the East Coast. And as this happens, we will see a rise in this idea known as anti-clericalism. And this means that instead of trusting the clergy to have all the interpretive and theological answers, the people on the frontier will start to look for other places. And often enough, the place they will look is to themselves. Historian Nathan Hatch calls this a populist hermeneutic, as many people on the frontier will seize the right to interpret scriptures for themselves, and they will not consult authorities even when they come up with difficult questions concerning the interpretation of Scripture. So here's just one example of how this plays out from Hatch's book. He says this, quote, "In the first place, anti-intellectualism became an integral part of a profound upsurge to erase the distinction between gentleman and commoner, the privileged class and the people. And at the same time, obscure Christians, without social grace and literacy education, went beyond merely denying the right of the clergy to ascribe authority to themselves. They began to piece together a popular theology that inverted the traditional assumption that truth was more likely to be found at the upper rather than lower reaches of society." Unquote. In short, it became commonplace for the common man or woman on the frontier to assert that they could read the Bible for themselves, and that they did not need a professional from the ranks of the clergy to tell them what it meant. Now today, most Christians in America just take this for granted. Many of them will argue theology without ever having had an education in religion. Some may even challenge a person with a PhD in biblical studies if they were offered an interpretation that differed from their normal readings of Scripture. And this anti-clericalism will go hand in hand with another idea known as anti-intellectualism, which author Isaac Asimov once defined as a cult of ignorance in the United States, which nurtures the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. And possibly one of the best concrete examples I could give you is a frontier preacher named Lorenzo Dow. And here's just a short segment from one of his sermons which displays both anti-intellectualism and anti-clericalism. It says this in his sermon, quote, "What I insist upon, my brothers and sisters, is this: learning isn't religion, and education don't give a man the power of the Spirit. It is grace and gifts that furnish the real live coals from off the altar. St. Peter was a fisherman. Do you think he ever went to Yale College? No, my beloved brethren and sisters. When the Lord wanted to blow down the walls of a spiritual Jericho, he didn't take a brass trumpet or a polished French horn. No such thing. He took a ram's horn, a plain natural ram's horn, just as it grew. And so, when he wants to blow down the walls of a spiritual Jericho, my beloved brothers and sisters, he don't take one of your smooth, polite, college-learned gentlemen, but a plain, natural ram's horn sort of man like me." So with all this in mind, let's draw some conclusions about this tumultuous time known as the American Revolution. And probably the most noticeable product from this time period are two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. And both of these founding documents will be treated by Christians and non-Christians alike with a strong sense of reverence. And some people will even go so far as to call them inspired documents, virtually placing them on the same level of authority as the scriptures themselves. Another result from this revolution will be that it will become an ideal for Americans to be rebels. Words such as tyranny and authority will become negative words, while words like liberty and freedom will be seen as ideals that are not only worth fighting for, but worth dying for. And these ideals will spill over into the religious sphere as well. And many new denominations will form as these frontier Christians began to throw off the chains of tyranny of their older denominations, such as the older Congregationalists, the older Anglican Church, and the older Presbyterian Church. And instead, they'll form new groups like the Methodists, like the Baptists, or the Restorationists will form the Christian Church. A third development from this period will be the interpretive question of loose or strict constructualism, and which is better. In terms of politics, when dealing with this question, the operative question that will come out of it will be, well, what is the best way to interpret the Constitution? But when it comes to religion, the question will become, well, what is the best way to interpret the Bible? And finally, the ideas of anti-clericalism and anti-intellectualism will take root in America, and they'll be especially strong on the American frontier. And the result of all of these movements will be that there will be a backlash against educated clergy as authorities in matters of theology and biblical interpretation. And this will help us to understand that as we go through the various people that will be major players in the Restoration movement, many of them will not have a formal education. Many of them will not be ordained. Many of them will strike back against already established denominations in order to try something new.